Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and here we're back with another retrospective for an Assassin's Creed game 10 years after its initial release. This time we're talking about probably the most controversial Assassin's Creed game of all time, that being Assassin's Creed Unity. A game with obviously a very storied history in terms of public perception, initially coming out to major criticism due to the number of glitches and performance issues that the game had at launch, which largely stemmed from a very rocky development cycle and extremely high ambitions that really just sunk the reputation of the Assassin's Creed series, for it has ended up being a pretty historic failure for Ubisoft at the time that led to radical changes in how the series developed moving forward. However, because of Unity's high ambitions and those being a bit more realized now after patches to the game, that has allowed for there to not be as many glitches, and also again we have better performing hardware that has allowed this game to have a bit of a resurgence in the modern day, where you hear constant talk about how the game is now good after the patches and it's now the definitive Assassin's Creed game, to where, I mean, while I do think this game was far ahead of its time and it does at least attempt to innovate on the original AC formula, I do still find it tough for me to fully comprehend this as a good game when just so many of the new systems built for this game are deeply flawed in themselves. But mixing that in with a narrative that is just a complete mess in multiple facets, to where while there are people that love this game and think that the only issues with the game left with the patches, to me the issues with this game run much deeper than that. Even though, again, I think there are definitely good aspects to this game, to where for me it is certainly better than how the public perceived it back in the day, but for the current perspective, being that it's turned around to be one of the best games in the series, to me that is a bit of an overreaction in my mind. So while obviously with most of my retrospectives I do run through the main campaign from beginning to end, I actually do have a lot to say about this game before we even get to that. And the first thing I do really want to focus on here is the development cycle of this game, because I do think it's a very unique one in the Assassin's Creed series. Now, this game started development after development on Assassin's Creed Brotherhood wrapped up, with even the ending of that game having a bit of foreshadowing towards the French Revolution being a future setting, with both this game and Brotherhood being developed by Ubisoft Montreal 1, the same team that also ended up developing Assassin's Creed 1 and 2, and sadly not another entry after this, obviously probably due to the poor reception of this game, which is sad to see the original team that started the series get shut down after making a game that, at least on paper, innovates upon that original game's formula. Alongside that, again, Revelation started development alongside this game, despite the fact that that game came out 3 years before this game's release. It does lead to a bit of a strange dynamic with this game, in that there are actually numerous entries in the series that started development after or at the same time that Unity started development. Obviously, AC4 and Rogue being major examples there, leading to major inconsistencies in Unity's story, as we'll obviously later talk about. But again, with this game starting development immediately after Brotherhood, which is in 2010, despite the broken state of this game at launch, the game did actually have a relatively long development cycle for the Assassin's Creed series, being given 4 years. Actually, one of the longest development cycles in the Assassin's Creed series, especially up to this point, to where, while there's a lot of talk about how this game's development cycle was simply too short, I think fundamentally it wasn't. Really, I mean, at this point in the gaming industry, 4 years for a AAA title was nothing to scoff at. I mean, that was pretty much the norm. Again, the length of the development cycle, I don't think, is the fundamental issue here. And really, most of the core issues with this game really come from the management of this game, where, again, I think the troubled development of this game can be chalked up to, again, high ambitions that this game had, along with it also utilizing a new engine for the first time. But mostly, I think the blame really comes down to poor management from Ubisoft in particular, to where, despite this game again being developed in 4 years, Alex Amancio, who ended up being creative director for this game, after having been the creative director for Assassin's Creed Revelations, whose development actually coincided with the development of this game, to where after he finished directing that game, he actually left Ubisoft for a few months, only to return in June of 2012, meaning about a year and a half after the game started development, to where, again, I think the game going that long without having its creative director is something that certainly didn't help things. And with that, I remember at the time a lot of people were blaming Alex for Unity's failures. However, the sense that I get really from the situation was that the game was already struggling before Alex rejoined the game, and he was really just trying to right the ship, only for that to be too difficult a task considering what Ubisoft wanted, and then wanting to stick to these yearly releases, and wanting a next-gen AC game to come out immediately after the release of the next-gen consoles, and forcing them out in a spot where they simply were not ready. And while there's still a lot of jankiness in this game to this day, if it did come out in the state that it currently is, because there definitely would not have been the backlash that there was to this game at the time, where obviously at the time you saw these ridiculous glitches that this game had, faces not popping in that really became this massive meme, to where again the game and really the Assassin's Creed series as a whole just kind of became a joke after this game's release. And it also just feels largely unnecessary that is the case, considering they also had Assassin's Creed Rogue to release on the same day as this game, to where I very much question why they didn't just release Rogue first and then release this game when it was ready, probably about a year from then. So again, the fact that they really rushed this out when it was simply not done yet ends up being a decision that, again, really ends up sinking Ubisoft's reputation, to where this mixed in with the release of Watch Dogs really made them known as this company that was releasing these broken games at launch, while also, again, having 2 Assassin's Creed games released on the same day just really oversaturates the brand as well. So again, it causes them to change the development cycle for Assassin's Creed moving forward, stop having these yearly releases, and seemingly has them turning away against the original Assassin's Creed formula. Though, to be fair, I think there's other outside circumstances that lead to that as well. And again, the negative reception of this game was not helped by the fact that this game also had the inclusion of microtransactions, where you can buy Helix credits that would allow you to buy some of the better equipment in the game, obviously earlier in the game. While also there was the companion app that would be necessary to unlock the game's legacy items, which thankfully they removed after the patches. But again, I do think these additions as well did not help with this game's reputation. But again, I can at least get the recovering image of this game, where I do think the more time goes on, the better this game ages. Where at the time, I mean, this was easily the best looking game I had ever seen. And straight up to this day, this is still one of the best looking games I've ever seen. I mean, the level of detail in this game is insane, with it having a densely populated city, having crowds numbering in the thousands, and almost every building being one that you can enter and explore. And while the patches did cap the game to 30 FPS, if you unpatch the game, you can also play it pretty stably at 60 frames on modern consoles without the constant performance issues halting your experience. So again, I think looking back on this game, I get how people appreciate what this game has to offer, especially after the radical changes made to the franchise through the RPG formula that's now become the norm, to where this is essentially the most modern game outside Mirage that tries to make you feel like an assassin and focuses on the pillars of gameplay that the Assassin's Creed series was known for. But despite this game having those things, it doesn't necessarily mean that they handle them well. And with that, let's start talking about the gameplay systems in this game, starting it off with Parkour, which is commonly talked about as the best in the series, implementing a new Parkour up and Parkour down systems as opposed to the previous system, which just had a singular free run button, where again, this game adds the ability of Parkour down, being a natural way for you to climb down a building, lessening the prevalence of leap of faiths in this game, and as instead you can climb down and see these flashy animations. And again, that is a big boon to this system as a whole, the fact that it is very flashy, it looks very good, to where again, it is an animation based system, to where the actions that you make are based around where you are at the time that you push the Parkour button, to which it'll play an animation. So again, if it works, it looks really cool. But the big issue with all this is the fact that it takes away from player agency, where due to this system being animation based, it means that you don't have full control over where your character is going, like you did back in AC1, to where while the agency, to be fair, had already been stripped away through AC3's new system, Unity takes that to a further extreme, to where here, it doesn't even feel like you have direct control over your character. Instead, you're spending most of the game just hoping that the game is thinking what you are thinking. There ends up being plenty of times where I intend on jumping to a specific ledge only for the game to jump to a different one instead, which many a times it just looks ridiculous because Arno's making these unrealistic jumps, but the game had computed that this pretty far away ledge is the one that I meant to jump over to, despite it being completely improbable. And again, there's also just many times where you want to jump off the edge of a building only for the game to not allow you to do so because it's confused over why would you want to do that when you can parkour down. But beyond that, something I do find very strange about this parkour system is that on paper it feels really rudimentary. It feels like there are not very many complex mechanics in the parkour system itself, to where again the concept of side ejects and a grab mechanic is something that was very common in the older systems. Yeah, in this game they seem to not be implemented, despite the fact that they actually are, and they're just like not told to you at any point in the game. So while I guess you can praise the game for trying to make you discover the parkour system yourself. It also just leads to you thinking the parkour system's just stripped away of the complexity that was there in the original game. Again, making this feel like a watered down version of the original game. And to be fair, it still is in my mind. As again, I do think the lack of player agency really does take a lot away from the parkour system. Though I do think a boon for this game in particular is the fact that it very much feels like this city was built around this specific system. For a while, there still ends up being a lot of ridiculous moments that you end up seeing through using the parkour system in this game. You can very much tell that there are many sections that feel tailor-made for this system in particular, allowing for really cool animations along the way to where, again, moving forward in this series, despite them utilizing this system, which again, this ends up being a system that is pretty much in place to the modern day, actually watered down. But even in comparison to something like Syndicate, I feel like that is something that really boons this game in particular over Syndicate's parkour system, and the fact that it feels like this game was more so built with this system in mind, where in that game it feels like the system was just simply an afterthought being added in just because they had bases around this system already made for Unity. But with that, I also want to talk about the stealth system in this game, to where social stealth still ends up being a major aspect of this game, as it should, considering it is a core fundamental of Assassin's Creed gameplay, but also considering the massive size of the crowds in this game, to where it allows you to really fulfill that aspect of the assassin fantasy, to where it does allow you to feel like you're hiding in plain sight. And to help you in stealth, you also are given a bevy of tools, from the typical type of bombs like cherry bombs, smoke bombs, stun bombs, with those latter two in particular being extremely helpful in combat when overwhelmed with enemies. But the more unique new tool added for this game is the Phantom Blade, which is essentially a crossbow that shoots from Arno's hidden blade, playing very similarly to throwing knives from OG game, though honestly I rarely use these. This game also has another major inclusion, something that I know people are very excited to see be added to the series, which is the crouch button, which again, people constantly say, how did it take this long for Assassin's Creed, a series based around stealth, to get a crouch button? When to me, this is a terrible inclusion to the series. So again, AC has never really been an outright stealth series, though a major component of its gameplay is, again, social stealth. Adding this addition of being able to crouch really takes away from social stealth, in an attempt to make this more of a genuine stealth game, of you just sneaking around areas and going into cover instead of ending into crowds and doing things in plain sight, which, to be fair, this has been a downward trajectory the series has had ever since AC3, with the inclusion of being able to hide in vegetation, though this, again, takes that notion to a further extreme. And even beyond that, the detection system in this game is just really broken, where there are many points in this game where you just be detected out of the blue, which can be very frustrating considering how the game encourages you to do things stealthily, considering how difficult the combat is. And with that, let's get to the combat, which ends up being a radical change up from the previous few entries, but one that I actually do genuinely like. I think Unity actually has one of my personal favorite combat systems in the entire series, with it feeling like a bit of a continuation of AC1's combat system, with this kind of coming off directly opposed to the issues that I have with the parkour system of this game, where after AC1, it felt like combat became a lot more show than substance, with Brotherhood in particular starting the ability to do chain kills, with that making combat look good, but ended up being extremely easy to play, while Unity ends up bringing the difficulty back to Assassin's Creed, making the combat feel a lot more grounded, and counter kills being taken out of the game. There ends up being a more parry-based combat system. And like AC1, you do have the ability to do heavy attacks, and can also access other abilities like staggering strike and ground executions to add more depth there. Where when mixing in the fact that you can also use range weapons and tools throughout combat as well, it does lead to this game's combat system feeling a bit more deep than the previous entries, though I've always personally been annoyed with how it's utilized in the game, where the game just seems to just throw billions of enemies towards you, to where this easily ends up being the most difficult Assassin's Creed game before the RPG turn. But it ends up being a game where after just a few hits, you're dead. Now, obviously you do have medicine, which returns in this game, which can allow you to regain health mid-combat encounter, which is really a necessity for this game. I feel like this game is near impossible to play without having medicine stocked up, especially considering health doesn't regenerate in this game. And again, I personally do feel like there are points where the difficulty gets a bit overboard, specifically from enemies having guns, where, again, a single shot from a gun will drain the majority of your health, which is, again, practical. But again, it just is very annoying how overpowered enemies with guns are in this game. So to be fair, it does further incentivize you to utilize stealth over brute forcing your way through an enemy encounter, though again, it would be better if stealth actually fully functioned properly. Now, with that, there are a wide range of weapons in this game, to where while I mostly played with the standard one-handed weapons, you can also use long weapons and heavy weapons, all of which having varying stats, and the same goes with armor as well, to the point where I did find the number of options here to be kind of overwhelming, to where I do think there is a major issue in this game, and the fact that there is a lack of transmog, to where some of the better equipment in this game straight up does not look particularly good, or it is annoying at points where you have to use this not as good looking armor for the sake of stats, which, with that, I should mention the fact that this game does take a further transition in adding in more RPG aspects to this game, to where we did get minor RPG aspects in previous games, and in AC4 we also got the naval upgrade system, which was essentially its own RPG system. This game takes that to another level, attaching the RPG mold to the base gameplay, the addition of various types of weapons and gear that all has their benefits outside of just basic statistics. There also now being an XP system and leveling system, along with there also being skills that you can buy over time, which can be pretty powerful and giving you additional melee attacks or unlock different tools. It allows you to double assassinate or increase your health. Also, the disguise skill is one that I particularly use pretty often, it being pretty handy in specific stealth situations, allowing Arno to disguise himself as a nearby guard, which, while useful, can also come off as ridiculous. And how is this happening practically? So again, I would get it if all he did is change his clothes, but again, it literally changes the entire character model, which is pretty dumb from a lore perspective. But also, skills can increase your ability at lockpicking, which is also a pretty useful ability in this game, to where in this game you can bypass locked doors using a mini game, where you can buy skills that make that mini game easier, which ends up being very helpful through many of the more difficult infiltration sections through the main campaign. But with that, I do want to now talk about the open world, where obviously this game is set in Paris during the French Revolution, with there also being an additional area in Versailles that you don't spend much time in, though Paris itself ends up obviously being a massive sprawling city pretty much built on a one-for-one scale, and as mentioned before, having a pretty insane level of detail, with most buildings in this game being able to be entered seamlessly. But even beyond that, you also have the ability to explore the city's catacombs that make the city even more expansive. And I know one of the big stories for this game is the fact that Notre Dame supposedly took an entire year to make in this game, which, I mean, to be fair, that could fall back onto the development issues that this game had, but clearly shows just how much work was put in to this world, to where again, mixing that with the fact that, again, they have these massive crowds, making this city feel alive, while also city, again, being a fun one to parkour through, and the parkour system functions. Again, it makes this feel like one of the most immersive cities in the history of the franchise. Now, a negative of this open world is how the game really ends up exemplifying the massive issue with modern Ubisoft games, and there being a ridiculous number of icons on the map here, with there just being so many superfluous markers on the map that just feel extremely overwhelming, to where this feels like one of the most representative games up to this point in the series, of being this bloated open world that Ubisoft is typically known for nowadays, to where there are just so many monotonous collectibles in this game, from chests to cockades to artifacts that don't add much to the experience. And another annoyance of this game is the fact that there's only one save file in this game, which is really dumb, to where if you want to restart the game from scratch, do a lot of the side content once again, you have to delete your previous progress. I mean, to be fair, AC1 did that as well, but again, obviously one of the worst things to possibly bring back from AC1. Despite that, the side content in the game is actually not entirely bad. After you end up having a headquarters like most of the previous games, and having the cafe theater, where you can do renovations that allow you to increase revenue over time, and along with that come the cafe theater missions, which were mostly just fine, pretty passable missions, though ones that don't do much for me personally. And the same thing goes with social club missions, which are unlocked by renovating social clubs around the city, which also increase revenue. Again, feeling like a very similar renovation system from previous entries, though again, the missions themselves are just kind of fine. But it does take us to the Paris stories, which are the more traditional side missions in this game, which are also pretty decent for the most part. So again, the majority of the missions are not really anything to write home about, but all of which do add to this notion that Paris is this living, breathing world, and it feels like Arno playing an actual role in that. But again, there are a wide range of missions there, most of which coming off pretty unique, with many of them not really utilizing the same mission types that are utilized in the main campaign. And by doing them, it makes you feel more connected to the city of Paris, making it feel like you're one of its inhabitants and helping your fellow citizens. But really, the best side content in this entire game, in my mind, ends up being the murder mysteries, a really cool new mission type here that allows you to solve murder mysteries by doing investigations and find clues at crime scenes and talk to witnesses. So again, having a LA Noir light style of missions was not something I ever expected to actually see in the Assassin's Creed series, though I think it was a pretty welcome addition here. And then we also got the Nostradamus enigmas, which are these riddles that can be found around Paris and end up really not holding your hand, with some of these actually being pretty difficult, with you needing outside of the game historical knowledge to solve these, which again is an interesting concept, though really most of the time I just look up a guide for the answers. But once you do all of them, you do end up unlocking the special armor for this game, which ends up being the armor of Tomas de Carnelion, who is certainly a character in this game, but really this comes off as a pretty lame reward, as the armor doesn't even look that great, and along with that, it's also just purely cosmetic, where, again, you would think, considering how difficult these riddles are to solve, that they would provide a pretty handsome reward for doing them, but no, it's just a cosmetic that doesn't have any other special abilities to it, which ends up being pretty lackluster. Another cool bit of side content ends up being the Helix Rifts, which actually relate back to the modern day, and you being transferred to other time periods, and you having to go through those levels and collect data within the time limit and rescue operatives. An interesting mission type to where, again, you rarely see the modern day actually be utilized as side content. So while it doesn't really redeem how lackluster the modern day is in this game, which is otherwise insignificant. So I found this an interesting mission type, the one that, I'll be honest, I kind of forgot even existed coming into my latest replay. So where, again, this is just another type of side content I would just consider kind of fine by the end of it. But a major focus in this game, particularly in its marketing, was the fact that this game also added in co-op to the franchise, having its own set of side missions that can be played with friends, though technically can also be played on their own. They're obviously much more difficult in doing so, with them obviously being intended to be played with others, to where I remember there being one in particular, the Tournaments, which has you collecting a wide range of flags during a specific time limit that is near impossible to do on your own. Though again, these are also pretty decent missions that do expand on the setting of the French Revolution, which doesn't get that much emphasis through the main campaign. So it's nice that they were able to do that through these missions, while there's also these heist missions that are less story focused, but also can be fun, where again, this is a good concept on paper to be able to play as an assassin with your friends, but obviously this ended up being kind of a failure, largely because of it blending into the myriad of technical issues this game had, to where, again, the system doesn't obviously function properly most of the time, to where I think it would be fun to see Ubisoft try this again in future entries. Obviously, the failure of this game probably deters them from doing that. But anyway, with that, now let's actually talk about the narrative of the game, to where, again, the strong suits of this game lie in its ambition from a gameplay front, but its narrative is where I do think a lot more of my criticisms really seep out here, especially from a modern perspective, to where no matter how functional this game is, the story of this game is a complete mess in almost every single facet, to where while there are interesting ideas in this game's story, I feel like they're never tackled effectively, to where it makes the entire story of this game come off as extremely shallow, despite it attempting to tell a rather unique story, not just in the AC series, but also in the world of gaming. Now, the story does take place during the French Revolution, which again, I do think is a really interesting setting for an Assassin's Creed game, with, in general, the concept of revolutions perfectly fitting into the Assassin-Templar conflict, though they end up handling this very strangely, where typically the assassins would be backing the revolution, with the Templars backing the established regime, correlating to their ideals. But for some reason, this game, it shakes up that formula and having the assassins backing the monarchy, while the Templars are backing and adding further sparks to the revolution, which doesn't really make much sense based on their philosophies, and in general, the French Revolution ends up being largely underutilized in this game. Now, for the most part, I actually think that is fine, especially after these last few entries that really take the historical tourism of the series to a new extreme, but I do feel like this game doesn't really focus on the setting enough, considering how good of a setting it is, with most of the focus on the setting and inclusion of the historical characters being relegated to side content, and even when it is in the main main story. A lot of it's just being there as being fan service outside of being things that are integral to how the story is being told, to where, again, this isn't necessarily a negative, as I do feel like Revelations, again, was also in this similar mold. But again, I feel like that game at least had a good story to tell, to where, again, I feel like this game ends up failing at telling a competent story, to where it ends up just seemingly wasting one of the strongest settings from a conceptual standpoint in the series. Though again, the story does primarily focus on Arno Dorian, who joins the Assassins in his quest for redemption after the murder of his adopted father, alongside his attempts to gain the affection of his adopted sister, Annalise Delaserre, who is a Templar, and again, that adds this interesting concept to this, of there being this talk about wanting to bring the two sides together. And again, I do think if you were to try to make that happen, I think adding in this dynamic of these star-crossed lovers on both sides of the conflict is probably the way to do it, which was one of the main pillars of this game's story in its conceptual stages, where Amancio supposedly was inspired by games like Eco to be wanting to make a game revolved around a love story, which, again, I do think can work, but sadly all this just comes off very one notes, where, again, it feels just like what happened in Rogue, and them just having these very shallow portrayals of the two sides, taking no regard for those sides' actual ideals in favor of reducing this to just Arno's love of Elise and Elise's obsession over wanting revenge for her father. Or again, that ends up seeming to be the core of this game's story, which again is a much more shallow portrayal than had this game try to tackle the philosophical debate between the two sides and how they can reconcile the two. Though a funny aspect of how this game is presented is that while the acting in this game is pretty strong, and the dynamic between Arno and Elise does feel very grounded and is one of the stronger aspects of this game, it is still done with both of them having English accents over a French one, to where, again, pretty much every character in this game ends up having an English accent, which, to be fair, there is precedent to them not utilizing the native accent, where in AC1 we obviously have Altair being given an American accent, though even there it was kind of jarring. And again, here it just feels like a very strange decision to make when many of this game's actors were also French speakers, to where it does feel like it just takes away from the immersion of the game, though at the end of the day also it's just kind of a nitpick that doesn't end up being that detrimental to the overall experience. But with that, I do want to talk about Arno as a character, where Arno gets commonly talked about as the poor man's Ezio, and while I can get those comparisons from an archetype perspective of them obviously being these young, charismatic figures, I do feel like their arcs play out in a polar opposite way, to where Arno's story largely comes off as a tragedy here, feeling more in line with the likes of Connor, to where while I can get how that leads to people looking down on Arno as a character and the fact that he doesn't get this typical hero's journey that Ezio gets, and just in general, Ezio is obviously just a better written character than Arno, with Arno's writing being a bit of a mess like the rest of the game. I do still come out of this game actually liking Arno and feeling like he was a character that had a lot of potential that just obviously comes off pretty underdeveloped. But with that, again, I think it's time to finally start running through the game from beginning to end. Obviously starting off with this game's prologue, where the game does start with a cinematic that ends up being this weird introduction to Helix, the type of animus utilized in AC4, but now us seeing it from the consumer side, with the game having us play as ourselves playing the Helix, which is still dumb, the notion of the modern day character being you, the player, but being a different you for every game. But either way, it does take us to a selection screen of which mission we're going to play, which ends up being chock full of references to previous games, with every previous main game entry being referred to here, alongside a Shao Jun game, which would have been cool to see, but also a Roman Empire game, which I also wish we got, but also a Jazz Age game, which I'm sure was a joke, as it would be a terrible setting for an AC game, alongside a game revolved around the Irish War of Independence, which thematically could work, though obviously would be too modern of a setting. But the only playable option here ends up being the Tragedy of Jacques de Molay, which takes us to a set piece taking place in 1300s France, where the opening section of this game has us strangely playing as Jacques de Molay's advisor, which is weird, but this ends up being a pretty interesting concept to have this section to add to the legacy of Jacques de Molay in this game, the last Grand Master of the real-life Knights Templars, where, again, I think conceptually they did something kind of interesting here in trying to parallel Emily's story with Germain's, with Germain essentially being his living legacy. But again, these connections end up just being very shallow and not focused on until the tail end of the game, with them simply being referenced here and not mentioned again until sequence 10, and even then not ever adding any real depth to the game. But through this, we do get to see the fall of the Templars from the advisor's perspective, essentially being a tutorial to the game's basic systems. Though while being tasked with recovering some Templar artifacts, we end up finding an assassin grab them first, that being Tomas de Carnelian, who really ends up being hyped up as this important assassin during this time, again being the one that caused the fall of the Templars here, where we see reverence for him during Arno's time, though it's very strange that he's introduced as an antagonist here, and we really know nothing about him, to where again, it could have been cool to see this parallel being made between Arno in the modern day and Tomas in a similar way to how Altair was utilized in Revelations, but no, obviously he's just a shallow character that simply just shows up here for having the assassins involved in the fall of Jacques de Molay. But anyway, gameplay wise, we end up having to chase the assassin down, we get a short boss battle with him, where he is pretty easy to defeat, which is lame for a master assassin, especially when using the Sword of Eden, which I will say, I remember at the time being very excited to see the sword being utilized here as the main piece of Eden in this game, to where we see them finally branching out and utilizing these pieces of Eden from previous lore, though what a shocker, they don't do much with it, and instead it just ends up feeling like it's here because they were like, hey, we need a piece of Eden in this game, and Arno uses sword, so we can give him the sword when the game is done. But anyway, the advisor ends up resealing the sword and Jacques de Merlay's codex in a vault, which I'm sure we'll never see again. And just as the advisor leaves that vault, we see Jacques de Merlay get arrested, and the advisor proceeds to be assassinated by Tomas, which is dumb, as how did we play this mission if he died in this moment? I mean, like, whose memories are we playing as then? Like, does that mean that this entire thing is fabricated? Because again, this makes no sense based on the basis of genetic memories. But again, these events have to be canon as it leads into the end of the game, which is canon for sure. So again, none of this really makes sense. But anyway, 7 years later, we see Jacques de Merlay get executed, where we see him condemn the king as he does so, cursing his bloodline, obviously implying his later role in the fall of the monarchy, because as we learn much later, he is a sage, with him passing his knowledge down to Germain, who is another sage, ending up obviously playing a major role in the revolution, which does lead to this prophecy coming true. But with that, I guess I should talk about the entire concept of sages in this game, which again just feels very disconnected to the rest of the series, to where again, in release order, sages are first introduced through Black Flag, through Bart Roberts, with him establishing that sages are reincarnations of Aita, and end up looking just like him. And despite that, in this game, we see two sages that look absolutely nothing like Aita. And also, we have no mentions of Juno in the base game here, despite the fact that sages constantly focus around wanting to bring Juno back to life in AC4. But again, that aspect of them is non-existent here, to where my interpretation of this is that, again, I think this is very much due to the wonky development cycle of this game. So I think there's probably two options of how this went, to where either sages were initially concepted during the writing of Unity, but Darby decided to expand it further in Black Flag in a way that didn't fully work its way back to Unity, to where, again, as we see in AC4, also all sages have heterochromia, to which, to be fair, Germain does have as well, though for some reason Jock doesn't have it, which I believe has been explained as a developer oversight, which is pretty ridiculous. That's a thing that they missed, as something that's pretty integral here. Though I do think another likely explanation for all this is the fact that I think from a conceptual standpoint, Jacques de Merlay and Germain were obviously supposed to be directly tied together from the initial writing of this game, though I do wonder if they were initially not sages, and if the concept of sages was not made until Darby created the concept of sages, and it was just shoehorned into this game after the fact. So I think that's actually more likely what happened here, in that sages were thrown into this game at the very last second, outside of sages being more so a retcon made during the writing of Black Flag itself. But with that, we then get to the proper introduction to the modern day, where following this, we end up getting a message from Bishop. Not her real name, but what do you know, she ends up also being a really shallow character, where she's here alongside Deacon, who's always off screen, though is also very clearly Sean Hastings, though obviously he doesn't do anything of substance in this game. But again, they're obviously assassins hacking into our consoles, I guess, and telling us to search through the memories of Arno Dorian to help the assassins for some reason. Like, don't know why they're just randomly recruiting random people playing a video game, but again, that's literally the entire basis of this modern day. And straight up, again, this game just has a terrible modern day that just feels like a complete afterthought in this game, most of which being these cinematics or voiceovers that don't really progress the overall plot of the modern day, with this feeling like a point where they simply just did not know what to do with the modern day. Despite this game coming out after Black Flag, which already had some modern day progression after the death of Desmond, with it setting up the Juno storyline, this game simply doesn't progress that at all. Now, to be fair, again, Black Flag started development after this game, so it wouldn't shock me if this game's modern day or lack thereof was already determined for the previous entries, like AC4 and Rogue, but was obviously developed with the knowledge that Desmond was going to die in AC3, with this game again starting development alongside that game. So again, I do get the notion of them just deciding to make this game's modern day irrelevant to not contradict anything to come out before this game, though somehow they still end up doing that anyway. And really, this game is just the true indication that they simply just did not know what they were doing when they killed off Desmond, to where it feels like they simply just killed him off again to wind down the modern day, to appease the casual audience, to where here, with that decision made, they simply decided to just meander around with the modern day instead of actually starting something new or continuing off what was already established in Black Flag. To where again, despite the fact that something new was already started by the time this game actually came out, they somehow make the decision to just not progress the modern day at all over the course of 2 entries that come out this year. To where, again, it's actually insane that 2 main entries in the series came out and neither of them added anything of significance to the grander narrative as a whole. But with that, let's actually finally jump into the Ancestor storyline, starting off with Sequence 1, being a typical opening sequence of the game, obviously introducing the protagonist here in Arno and his backstory, alongside giving us tutorials to many of the game's systems, but in all, feels like a very solid setup to Arno's story, even though the game as a whole doesn't live up to that. But yeah, we start off the game in December of 1776, where Arno, alongside his father Charles Dorian, have traveled to the Palace of Versailles, where Charles has a meeting, to where he ends up instructing Arno to sit in a chair and not run off while he meets his associates, giving him his pocket watch to keep track of time. And what do you know, Arno ends up running off anyway, because he sees a mysterious young girl that he ends up chasing, instantly showing us his infatuation with Elise and how much trouble that gets him into, which obviously becomes a central pillar within this game's narrative, to where she ends up goading him into stealing an apple from a bowl of apples that guard is guarding for some reason, to which in doing so gives us a tutorial to the stealth system in this game, to which in itself ends up being probably the strangest tutorial from any of these games. But following this, we do see Arno and Elise introducing each other, which is a scene that you might have already seen if you played AC Rogue, to where in this moment we see soldiers rushing towards the main hall, to where we do see Arno apologizing for stealing the apple, thinking that that's the reason why they're here, only to find out the commotion is actually because Charles has been assassinated. To where it's obviously in this moment where we see Shay passing by Arno, aka, Shay's nowhere to be seen because obviously he was a retcon. But again, this game clearly being fully written by the time that Rogue was even concepted. Again, Shay's lack of relevance to this game's story just ends up being really funny looking back on it. But either way, as Arno sees his father dead, he does melodramatically drop Charles's pocket watch, which as it hits the ground, it obviously breaks, which could have been great symbolism about how much his life is broken after losing his father, only for that to seemingly not matter to him moving forward, where he seems to more so care about the death of Delasere over his actual father. But it's in this moment where we see Francois Delasere be there to help Arno, proceeding to adopt him, with Delasere conveniently being the Grand Master of the Templars and Elise's father, immediately giving him another father figure in this game, leaving Charles's murder pretty irrelevant for the rest of the story, especially by the end of Sequence 2, with again us more so focusing around Arno's relationship with Elise instead. Though again, I do think conceptually this is actually an interesting idea, again, having Arno be raised by the Templars in a way that makes him sympathetic towards the Templar cause. And I do think had they actually tackled the beliefs between the two sides and showed more reason for why the two sides would work together outside just the general concept of wanting peace, I do think, again, it could have led to an interesting narrative, but again, it's all wasted. But either way, with that, we cut to 13 years later as an older Arno steals back his father's watch after losing it in a card game, leading to him bantering with the two that he stole it from, that being Hugo and Victor, who are largely irrelevant characters, though again, this ends up showing Arno as this more charismatic troublemaker being a similar tone to Ezio's introduction in AC2, but this leads to a chase sequence as our first bit of gameplay in the open world, showing us the scale of the crowds right away, though this opening sequence does actually take place in Versailles over the grander map of Paris that we will later go to. But again, I do like having this opening chase sequence to get you accustomed to your new surroundings, even though this does end up being a bit overused in this era of AC. But after returning to the Delasere estate, we do see Francois preventing Arno from being arrested, showing Delasere being his guardian father figure once again to show the Templars in a better light, I guess. But as Delasere leaves, conveniently, a messenger ends up failing to deliver a message to him, to where Arno decides to deliver it himself, a letter that's said to be very important. Potentially life-saving. How convenient. This leads to a mission of us following around the carriage, which turns out to be the wrong carriage, with the man coming out of it turning out to be Germain, the game's main antagonist, which is such a strange cameo here that doesn't add to anything outside of the minor reaction on a replay of you seeing that he showed up here, though again, it has no narrative significance outside of just saying that he was in Versailles the day of Delasere's murder, which is kind of to be expected. After doing our first viewpoint, we do find Delasere's carriage, to where we get our first dose of stealth, as we have the sneaker away to an assembly, conveniently being the Estats General of 1787, aka the inciting incident of the French Revolution. How convenient that Arno's there for that. But in reality, I mean, as I mentioned, this game doesn't actually do much shoehorning in of Arno into these historically important events, especially in comparison to AC3, where while Arno might be there for some of these events, he simply doesn't play much of a role in these events, where unlike Karner, who, again, supposedly made a lot of these events happen, with Arno, he's simply just there as these events happen in the background, which again is kind of better, I guess. But through this, we do end up seeing Delasere talking to Mirabeau, a cameo that will be more integral to the story than Germain. For Mirabeau, while being a prominent historical figure, also ends up being the mentor of the assassins at this point, showing the assassins and Templars already working on a truce, setting up Delasere's later assassination and the cause for it. But before Arno's able to deliver the letter, he gets distracted by Hugo and Victor cornering him, leading to our first bit of combat in this game, and for Hugo and Victor to not play a factor to the narrative moving forward. But with this, Arno ends up giving up looking for Delasere and instead decides to just slip the letter under his office door, as he instead wants to spend a night with Elise attending a party at the Palace of Versailles, showing his obsession with Elise and inadvertently setting all these pieces into action, or at least not stopping these things from happening, to where I think that's another aspect of the story that does feel very dumb, that it feels like Arno himself takes a lot of the blame for the later assassination of Delasere, but also like Elise ends up putting blame on him as well, despite the fact that, again, he didn't murder him. He simply unknowingly had what could have stopped the murder, but again, he didn't know that. Again, it does lead to some ridiculous in how much blame gets put onto him for that. But anyway, following this, we have Arno sneaking through the party, all while Sévère enters the party, as we need even more foreshadowing here. And also while in the party, you can use Eagle Vision, where you can interestingly see a certain group glow gold, the color of targets in this game. And while lore-wise, it doesn't make sense, as Arno doesn't know that they're his enemies yet, and has no reason to believe that they are, it is still a cool little touch here to have your future targets all being highlighted in this instance. But eventually you catch up with Elise, with us seeing Arno ignore another girl to end up following her, with us getting Elise's theme swelling during this scene, which in general, I've always liked the soundtrack of this game, to where while I do know it's one of the lesser respected soundtracks in the series, it's not really amongst my own personal favorites. I do still like this more somber orchestral music that plays throughout this game, with the main theme in particular standing out to me amongst AC themes, and it perfectly fitting into this more tragic trajectory that the story ends up heading towards. But with this, we do get to see our first true interaction between Arno and Elise as adults here, to where I do feel like this is one that really shows the strong suits of Unity and how well acted both the characters are, and how much chemistry there clearly is between the two main actors, so you do very much believe this relationship initially. So I believe the actors had worked together in the past, and you can very much tell the rapport here that allows their relationship to come off initially as really likable, with them having this playful banter and them joking about the ridiculous clothing that they're wearing. Following this, we do get another stealth section, us having to escape the palace, which is a pretty monotonous section, but it does lead to the inciting incident of the story, to where as Arno reaches the courtyard, he finds Francois Delasere staggering around, initially thinking that he's drunk, until he collapses to the ground, realizing that he's dying, which leads to Arno yelling out, Monsieur Delasere, in a way that I've always found really funny and have it stuck in my head. But again, Arno ends up being framed in this instance after Sévère leads guards to him, which Delasere's death here ends up really being the crux of this story, having Arno lose another father figure. With him being framed for his murder, he ends up wanting redemption beyond this, and this leads to him joining the assassins. Well, also, this ends up later motivating Elise to want revenge for his death, being the main motivation of her character moving forward. Well, also, this leads to the new leadership within the Templars, who obviously become the later antagonists in this game, to where, again, Delasair's death is such an integral aspect of the plot here, but again, I think it's in a way that very much takes away the impact of Charles Dorian's death, which is very strange because I mean, that's literally the opening moment of Arno's story. The fact that we see Charles's death, which again makes you think that's going to be an integral aspect of the story moving forward, only for it to simply just not. And with that, we do lead into sequence 2, which obviously leads up to Arno joining the assassins, which again continues to be a strong setup for this game, though it kind of goes downhill after this. But either way, Arno ends up being imprisoned within the Bastille, with one of his fellow cellmates calling him Piss Pot, which I'm sure we won't hear a billion times in this game. So the next morning, Arno ends up realizing that his father's watch had been stolen, leading to him getting into a fight with the person who stole it, leading to more tutorials where somehow an untrained Arno is overpowering a master assassin, who we learn is Pierre Belek, a former colleague of Charles's, to where he ends up realizing that Arno is special when he reveals that he can see some symbols on a nearby wall, with Belek saying that he's thrown himself into half the prisons in Paris in search of these, which it's like, why? And it's even funnier considering this literally has no impact on the story at all. This is never brought up again. It just feels like an excuse for Belek to be here to expedite Arno's journey, to where Belek ends up training Arno here over the next 2 months until we hear a commotion outside, which is when you realize that this is obviously the storming of the Bastille. Another major historical moment, but one that does lead to Arno and Belek making their escape, having to hold off guards as Belek opens the way, which can be a somewhat difficult encounter there, but it leads to us reaching the top of the building, where Belek prepares for a leap of faith, only for Arno to think that he's insane, which is funny as Arno can do leaps of faith earlier in the game, which is a dumb little detail that does take away from the impact of Arno's first leap of faith here, which ends up being utilized for the title card of the game. But obviously Belek ends up telling him to find the assassins as he leaves, which I wonder if Arno will do that. Before he does that, obviously Arno instead ends up returning to the Delasair estate and ends up finding Elise there, who is clearly still in grief, swearing revenge for her father, which consumes her for the rest of this game's narrative, while also revealing that she is a Templar, which Arno is somehow shocked by, despite the fact that by this point he knew that Delasair was a Templar. But she ends up proceeding to blame Arno for Delasair's death because of the letter, which is dumb. So again, yes, this letter could have potentially stopped things, but again, he didn't know that. And again, he also didn't follow through with it because his love for her. But obviously, at least being irrational in this state of grief does make sense here, but it can be a frustrating aspect of Elise's character. But now with Elise having turned him away as well, it is now that Arno finally decides to seek out the assassins, following a clue Belek left for him, sending him to the Saint Chapelle, leading him to an assassin tomb style section of him having to parkour through the upper level and eventually leap of faith into a hole that opens in the ground. So the next time we see him, he's just walking through the assassin headquarters, it not being shown where exactly he landed. But again, I do like the concept of the assassins having their headquarters underground, which again does match or so of their philosophy, not having a massive homestead or a castle that is just out in the open. Though this also does end up playing very much into the themes of fanaticism, which is pretty much the core theme of this game, and with us getting introduced to the Assassin Council, who ends up running a really tight ship, seemingly very narrowly focused on the Creed, which while you can look at this group as boring, as they don't really get much development here, I do find the Parisian Brotherhood, how they operate, kind of interesting here, and that they're obviously extremely old-fashioned, and I'm looking at the Creed as the end-all be-all, and not being willing to deter from that. But anyway, Arno here is told to drink from a goblet that leads to a typical dream-like sequence, plus having to play through Arno's psyche, which I've talked about in the past, that I've never loved these style of sequences, with it feeling like the game just outwardly telling you Arno's traumas, with us getting focused here on the murders of Arno's father and Delasair, showing him running through the Palace of Versailles as it crumbles around him, and then showing him assassinate an assassin standing over their dead bodies, with the assassin being himself, obviously representative of the guilt and blame that he puts on himself, which, I mean, makes sense for Delasair, I guess, but doesn't really make sense for Charles's death. Again, this leads to Arno being initiated into the assassins in a spot where he doesn't really join the assassins due to their ideals, where, again, this is a spot where Arno never seems to actually genuinely care about the Creed and more so joins them because they were the only ones willing to take him in during this low point in his life, but also gave him this way for him to redeem himself for his previous mistakes. Again, feeling very reminiscent to Shay and how shallow his motivations are in AC Rogue. Again, makes this game also feel extremely shallow from an AC perspective, with very little philosophy being added into this game's narrative, as again, Arno himself doesn't care about the philosophy of the assassins, and is seemingly doing this as a way to redeem himself to Elise. But either way, following this, we do get a short modern-day cutscene where we, the player, end up joining the assassins, because I guess this is the way people are initiated now, and we're shown a video of the Phoenix Project, talking about the Triple Helix, essentially explaining Sage's and the Templar's current goal of finding more, because they want to recreate a full precursor genome, which I'm sure will lead to a lot in a modern day. But again, this ends up being a plot that I very much suspect was created at the last second. I mean, this is one that directly ties in with Black Flag in the sense that the reason why the Templars are doing this is because the information that they got from the body of John Standish at the end of AC4, where, again, to me, this comes off as something they created at the last second to tie in AC4 story in a really shallow way, to where it allows them to reference AC4 without actually doing anything that actually progresses the story itself. But here we do end up learning the reason why we're playing as Arno, which is because he encounters a sage at some point in his life, I guess. I don't understand how they would even know this without also knowing who that sage is, to where all this is kind of dumb. But really, this reveal of what the Templars are doing here ends up being really the only progression of the modern day in this entire game, which is funny. But anyway, it takes us to Sequence 3, which is where the game really opens up to where, with Arno now being an assassin, this is where most of the customization options and the side content ends up opening up, but it's also where this game's sequence structure becomes pretty clear, to where most of this game's sequences play out in a similar way to this sequence, comprising of two real missions, one being a setup to the upcoming assassination, with the other one obviously being the actual assassination, which most of these sequences in this game end up being relatively short, to where despite the fact that this game includes 12 sequences, the majority of them can be finished in well under an hour, making this a fairly short game, and one that is structured in a way that does largely come off as lazy to me. Again, making it feel like many of these upcoming sequences are simply just Arno narrowing down on his target, with very little depth being incorporated into the story along the way, as Arno is just simply following a trail of targets associated with Delasaire's murder, one after the other, which also ends up making the story come off as very fast-paced, as essentially every other mission we're getting to an assassination mission, with those targets not really getting much depth to them. Again, this all starts off with a pretty mundane mission of us having to clear out an area and escaping that leads to us finding out that Sever will be at the Notre Dame the next day, again, setting up that assassination. But following this, we do get to see some of the tension within the assassins, and us seeing Balek criticizing Mirabeau for his attempted truce with the Templars, which again, I wonder if that'll matter. But it does lead to Arno wanting the Council's blessing to assassinate Sever, with Mirabeau warning him to not confuse your personal vendetta with sound strategy, only to proceed to allow Arno to do this anyway. To where again, we get to the Sever assassination at the Notre Dame, which is where I should probably talk about the actual assassination missions and how they play in this game, with them being black box missions, being fairly non-linear, and the game giving you these sizable areas for you to utilize to your benefit, and you being able to assassinate your target in any way, which is a high level of freedom that I enjoyed from this game, playing similarly to how the Hitman games play, and there being these assassination opportunities that can give you unique kills, and also there being infiltration opportunities that allow it to make it easier to get through these restricted areas, which straight up, I mean, these are not utilized as well as the Hitman series, where, and really, I think this is actually an aspect of the game that Syndicate actually improves on in the following game. But again, there are cool additions to be had here, even though the game never really bothers explaining to you what you can actually do with these opportunities, just telling you that these are things that are available for you to do, to where at the end of the day, it just feels like it's easier just to go and assassinate your target outright than even utilize these options. Though, again, the fact that the options are there does increase the replayability of these missions. And again, feels like another attempt to call back to AC1 and how open those assassinations were, along with the fact that you can also only assassinate your target using the hidden blade, still incentivizing stealth during these encounters, to where mixing that with the fact that you also don't get a checkpoint until after you escape. It really makes it so, again, you can't really just run in there and assassinate your target, as you more than likely won't make it out alive, to where, as a whole, again, I do love the concept of these black box missions and the variety that they bring to the gameplay, though, again, I think we get mixed success in Unity itself, itself, with not every mission living up to its potential, though the severe one ends up being a pretty good one here. Though, straight up, I do end up playing this one pretty much the same every single way, lockpicking the side entrance to get into the building and then either outright assassinating him, or doing the unique kill opportunity of killing him from a confessional booth, with this ending up being one of the more notable assassinations in this game for me. But this is where we also get the reveal that instead of the memory corridor sequences that we typically get from pretty much every other AC game, this game instead gives you visions of Arno's target's memories for some reason, which is never explained. Now, technically, Arno's eagle vision is portrayed in a way that it is a bit underdeveloped, with him not being able to utilize it for long periods of time. And again, you can say that this is a ramification of that, but that doesn't really make sense. Isn't this a better ability? And it's like, again, how is he being able to see real life events that happened previously? And none of this is ever explained. And simply, it's just a plot device being utilized to show us targets for the following sequence. As in this one, we end up seeing Severe's partner in crime being revealed, and that being Leroy the Thuns, aka the King of Beggars, who obviously we spend the entire next sequence hunting down. But first, we do actually jump into some sort of modern day content here, in that we get the reveal that Abstergo is looking for us, I guess, and through that is doing a server sweep, meaning that we now need to go through a server bridge to avoid being deleted, I guess, which happens periodically in this game, linked to a set of set pieces that take us to different points in Paris's history. For some reason. I mean, I guess the reason technically is just because they wanted that fan service of you being able to play in all these different time periods that they're never going to fully flesh out. So, again, do they provide any real depth to the modern day, and do they really do anything for the game itself outside of just being fun missions in their own right? No, but I do particularly love this first mission here, probably being the best one of the bunch, and it taking place during the Belle Epoque, about 100 years after the events of the main game, which has us having a pretty fun parkour section through the Metro network, which felt very reminiscent to an Assassin Tomb, with it concluding with us climbing an incomplete Statue of Liberty, which the game itself admits makes no sense timeline-wise, but again, it's a cool set piece to be parkouring around as the area is crumbling around you. But either way, it takes us to sequence 4, which revolves around Arno hunting down the King of Beggars, taking us to the poor district of the city, where we meet Marquis de Sade, who is a historical figure that is extremely controversial, yet this game portrays him as a comic relief character, which is weird, and he ends up also being an ally for Arno, to where, again, just strange how he's glorifying him in this instance. But this is followed by one of the very few tailing missions in this game, where we have to tail Latouche, the King of Beggars lieutenant, which I guess we should talk about a minor change being made to tailing missions and how they operate in this game, and the fact that something really hyped up in this game before it came out was the inclusion of adaptive missions, meaning that there are several ways for you to complete missions. It translates to tailing missions in the sense that, unlike typical AC games where if you lose sight of your target, it would automatically desync there, but in this game it actually allows you to continue despite that, giving you a radius of where the target is, again making tailing a bit easier, though it still doesn't take away the monotony of tailing missions, with you still failing if you're detected. But also beyond that, the real difficult aspect of the tailing missions in this game are you having to remain undetected while in restricted areas, which again still leaves them being pretty annoying here. But either way, through this we end up learning the king's hiding spot in the sewers, taking us to the assassination mission, which again ends up being one of the more lackluster ones, being one that is extremely linear, to where while it is very open at the very beginning, where you have to find a way to get to the underground, once you get to the underground, it ends up just being a linear path to the main room, to where you do find a dead assassin there, revealing that it was an ambush, with the king being at the top of a nearby ledge, to where to get to him, you have to climb up to him, which can be largely annoying with many enemies around you having guns that can shoot you down. Also, because you're essentially forced to be detected for this assassination, ends up leading to the assassination itself being a bit janky, to where again, you still have to end every assassination with the utilization of the hidden blade, but there's no way to select the hidden blade to be used, meaning that you just have to pray that the game allows you to use your hidden blade at a point. But again, kind of just a janky assassination mission. But with this, the trail continues with us finding out through his memories that him and Severe were merely puppets being led by a mysterious new Templar leader that we conveniently can't see his face here. Though we do find out that the pin used to kill Delasaire was created by Francois Thomas Germain, taking us to sequence 5, where we infiltrate Germain's workshop, which ends up being a pretty difficult section, being this massive restricted area. But eventually we do find Germain, who ends up pretending to be held against his will, and that he was being forced to make this equipment for the Templars, with there being a nice little touch at the beginning of this scene of Germain taking a long pause to recollect himself before talking to Arno, clearly coming up with the ruse on the spot there. But again, this leads up to us having to escort him out of the building, kill some snipers, only for Germain to tell Arno that he made the pin for someone named Lefreniere, who Arno now assumes must be the new Grand Master, all of which coming off as really ironic, as Arno is actually talking to the new Grand Master that actually killed Delasaire, with Germain really manipulating him in a way that I actually think is probably the most impressive individual villainous maneuver that a main Assassin's Creed antagonist does throughout the entire series. Through this, he's able to trick Arno, who is unknowingly actually trying to assassinate him, into actually assassinating his biggest opponent instead, someone that would have worked with Arno to take down Germain. So while Germain ends up being a pretty shallow antagonist by the end of it, I actually do like the way that he's introduced in the story here, them coming off as this pretty maniacal villain, though I do find the handling of his later reveal a bit strange, and that here you can clearly tell that he is a sage in him having heterochromia. Though, again, at the end of this sequence, before you're meant to know that Germain is the Grand Master, Bishop just reveals that the Grand Master that Arno is hunting is a sage, aka pretty much just spoiling the fact that Germain is the Grand Master, which, I mean, to be fair, again, it's not very difficult to piece together. Again, it's very weird that we are essentially told that Germain is the Grand Master before Arno has any sense that this is even a possibility. But either way, following that, we get a pretty superfluous mission of us having to destroy Lefreniere's gunpowder supply that I mostly remember for ending in a pretty decent parkour set piece of us having to escape the burning building, though the sequence does culminate in Lefreniere's assassination mission, with Arno deciding to go through with this assassination before getting approval from the assassins. For some reason, I mean, dumb as we later learn that they would have approved it anyway, and this is just here to show Arno not following orders, putting him on rocky terms with the assassins, which again plays into his character and the fact that he, I guess, thinks that this would get him that redemption and that he is so dedicated to getting that redemption, but again still also feels inconsistent, but also very convenient that he's doing this now. But again, the assassination takes place in a cemetery, which is a pretty unique one, the fact that you have to initially find just a hiding spot for you to wait in, where you can set up opportunities for a later assassination before the target shows up. Though beyond that, ends up being a pretty simple assassination, one that has you having to sneak up to Lefreniere with a bevy of enemies around him that, again, can be tough to do undetected. But with this assassination, we do learn that Lefreniere was the one that actually penned the letter to Delasaire that Arno failed to deliver. Again, a spot where it should have been clear to Arno that he was in the wrong in killing him here and that he was actually an ally, but for some reason he doesn't figure that out until a bit later. But with this, we do learn that Lefreniere was planning an attack on the Hotel de Beauvoir, which takes us to sequence 6, where Arno decides to, for some reason, go back to the council and tell them what he was doing, with them being pissed at him for choosing his own targets, which is ironic considering how the assassins fight for free will, which again, if this was called out in the story, the hypocrisy of the assassins, it would have been an interesting turn for the narrative, but it doesn't lead to anything, and instead we follow this up with Arno being allowed to continue his investigation anyway, taking us to the Hotel de Beauvoir, which is essentially the other tailing mission in the game, also tailing Latouche, who I guess is the only tailable character in the world of AC Unity. And again, this could be a very difficult mission here, being really reinforced to where, while the goal of this mission is simply just eavesdropping on a Templar meeting, it can be difficult to do so, though conveniently this meeting ends up containing all the remaining Templar targets, conveniently giving us a checklist of targets to take out later in the game. But here we do learn that the Templars are planning an ambush on Elise, leading to the other mission in the sequence, having us rescuing Elise and escorting her through a hedge mage and killing a bunch of enemies along the way, which is all monotonous, which again ends up being a really strange ending to sequence 6, with sequence 6 probably being the most irrelevant sequence in the entire game, being one that feels like it definitely could have been merged with sequence 7, where it feels like one that was simply broken up into its own sequence for the sake of having 12 sequences by the end. But anyway, we get to sequence 7, which has Arno and Elise back together, to where beyond this they end up working together to find Delasaire's killer, with them hoping to bring in the assassins to help them do so. You know, the unity that was implied through the title that we previously saw Delasaire attempt, only for that to just not go through. But we do get this humorous scene through this of Arno letting Elise into the headquarters but putting a blindfold on her. You get the spike despite that, she's still able to recite exactly how to get there. But again, this brings back this previous conflict between Mirabeau and the other assassins, with Mirabeau considering making this deal with Elise, only for Belek to fight against it. But as they dispute, we do see Arnaud and Elise go off on their own, only for Arnaud to, out of the blue, mention Germaine, a name that Elise clearly recognizes. And instead of talking it out, she just runs off towards his workshop, because that's a thing normal people do. And being pretty representative of their relationship for the rest of the game, where Elise is clearly obsessed with the notion of getting revenge for De La Serre and is willing to do anything for that. Oh, well, Arnaud is clearly obsessed with Elise and ends up chasing her in this instance, like he does the entire game. But clearly Arnaud would do and does do anything for her, only for her to obviously have these other motivations, then to really skewing this relationship into a pretty toxic one. But obviously when they do end up arriving, Elise does finally decide to tell Arnaud what's happening here, and the fact that Germaine was De La Serre's lieutenant, who is exiled, and that they believed he was dead. Though after fighting off an ambush, we do find a hidden room to find out that he was De La Serre's killer. I can't believe it. And who would have guessed it? We also get ambushed again, because obviously, again, really funny that Arnaud does not piece this together until this point. But again, following this, we do end up regrouping at Mirabeau's office with the intention of telling him this information, only to find him murdered. And I wonder who killed him, because it definitely wasn't the assassin we just saw him fighting with in the final scene that he was alive in. But here we do get an investigation section, which obviously plays very reminiscent to the murder mystery side missions in the game. But obviously we do find out that this assassination was done by an assassin trying to frame Elise by using Templar tactics here. So again, I wonder who it is. And we follow the trail, Saint Chapelle, where we find out it was Belek. I can't believe it. And him revealing that he did it because he doesn't believe in peace between the assassins and Templars, calling it a fairy tale, and considers what Mirabeau did as treason, and talks about his plans to purge the Brotherhood to make it stronger, and asks for Arnaud to join his cause, only for him to obviously refuse. And this entire situation with Belek ends up really epitomizing what is wrong with Unity's story in my mind, where conceptually I think this is a great idea. Again, showcasing an assassin with radical ideals and having the protagonist fight against that and show why he is wrong is, again, a good concept, and really connecting Belek to the themes of fanaticism. But again, I think the execution of all this is just wrong, where again, one, I feel like Belek's ideals do come off very underdeveloped, where we never actually see him fully talk through his actual beliefs outside of just the general notion of him not thinking that the assassins and Templars can work together. He doesn't really go much deeper into why he believes that way. So again, I do feel like we could have used more setup and more time with Belek, and with that also ties into the grander issue in that, why is this here? Not as in why is this in the game, but as why is it at the halfway point in the game and not the end? Or to me, I think this would have been a much more satisfying ending to the game. Again, a game called Unity that you would think would be focused on unifying the Assassins and Templars, or at least exploring the idea of that. I think it would make a lot more sense if the final antagonist in this game, while playing as an assassin, is a fellow assassin that tries to go against those ideals. So the fact that this fight happens in the mid portion of the game, instead of Belek being the final antagonist in the game, is underwhelming. So again, to me, the main conflict of this game should have been conflicts within each faction, with Belek obviously being the culmination of the assassin side of that story, which would put more weight into Belek's defection here, but instead it largely just comes off as an afterthought. As following this, we don't really take much time to really process what just happened here, instead just go back to the more tropey Templar hunts, where it feels like that's kind of what this game evolved to. So again, it felt like initially the story was taking this interesting direction and showing this kind of civil war between each of the factions, but by the end, it essentially just ends up being a more typical just assassin hunting down Templars and killing a Templar at the end, which is not nearly as interesting. And straight up, the actual boss battle here, while again, cool from a storytelling perspective, it doesn't play the greatest, where we end up having some very strange camera angles here to make it tough to see what's going on, and beyond that, there's also like dumb QuickTime events. Though obviously at the end, we do end up defeating Belek, obviously being this big dramatic moment for the story, only for it to be broken up by our next server bridge mission. This one taking us to World War II Paris, which has us climbing up the Eiffel Tower, which again is cool fan service there, and while again World War II would be a terrible setting for Assassin's Creed, it is cool to play this section here and it having this very modern aesthetic to it. Though something I don't love about this section is that culminates in us using these machine guns to shoot down planes, which is not a fun gameplay mechanic in the slightest, and also just can be kind of dumb in the fact that how is Arno not instantly dying from these shots from a machine gun? But anyway, it ends up being another solid mission here. They're probably my least favorite 3 server bridge missions. But with that, we then get to sequence 8, a shorter chapter that just feels like the plot meandering at this point, with us working with the assassins again for some reason. Again, this is in the aftermath of the deaths of Mirabo and Belek, literally the 2 assassin characters that we saw him have any sort of connection to where once they're gone and him also not even believing in the assassin's ideals, it's like, why is he here? And again, he doesn't even bother communing with them following this mission until his later fallout with them. So again, why is he even bothering to do a task for the assassins in this moment where, again, the sequence starts with this pointless mission of us being tasked with destroying some evidence from Mirabeau's correspondence with King Louis for some reason. Again, a mission that feels like a waste of time that's also kind of difficult here, and you having to, again, stealth through a massive restricted area. That, again, just feels like it's here so you can meet up with Napoleon, again, check another historical figure off the board, but also revealing how he got his Apple of Eden, even though that becomes completely irrelevant to the main campaign beyond this. But during this mission, we do end up seeing that the extremists that occupy this building are being led by Frederic Roulet, one of the Templars from the meeting earlier. So I wonder who we're going to assassinate, and what do you know, we get to the Roulet assassination mission, which ends up being another underwhelming assassination here, feeling pretty limited in how Roulet can be killed, and the fact that he is at the top of a prison, though the options how to get there are, again, very far and few between, with many of the paths to the top being blocked off, again, kind of nullifying the purpose of black box missions. But this one can be a pretty difficult encounter if you just rush right to him, though, where, again, he is surrounded by a bevy of enemies, and he ends up being pretty tough to take out there, though you can also actually just take out the snipers around him to make this a bit easier. But again, overall, a lackluster assassination here. Through this, we do learn that Germain's plan is to starve the people of Paris, to turn public opinion against the monarchy, a plot that is being led by Marie Levesque. Taking us to sequence 9, where Arno regroups with Elise and works with her to take down Marie, which, like, why wasn't she involved in the previous sequence? Where, again, there's no real explanation of why that was the case, making that last sequence feel even more disconnected, though this leads to a mission of us having to follow a boat, which can involve some fun parkour if it works. And then we get a somewhat difficult stealth section following this of us having to steal orders from the other end of the deck, which I remember having a lot of difficulty with in my initial playthrough, though following it, we get the Marie assassination with us learning that she's in the Luxembourg Palace having a party, which ends up being one of the more difficult assassination missions in the game, with us having to infiltrate this massive building that I typically get lost in. So while you can theoretically just run into the building and assassinate her, finding your way out actually ends up being very difficult, with this building largely just coming off as a maze. But through killing her, we do see that the next Templar on the board, La Peltier, is plotting to execute King Louis, which I guess we're going to try to stop him, which is like, why do we care? Or again, just weird to see the assassins working with King Louis earlier, and now Arno again attempting to essentially stop a revolution against a monarchy, which again doesn't seem to fit within assassin ideals. But either way, the sequence ends with one of the more notable missions in the game of Arno and Elise escaping through a hot air balloon, with Elise getting on, but Arno having to chase her down. Again, indicative of their relationship. But again, it's a fun section here where, again, if parkour works, you parkouring through the rooftops to catch up to the balloon ends up being kind of fun. But once we do get in the hot air balloon, we do get a romantic moment between Arno and Elise that can look really funny if Arno has a specific outfit on where his face clips through his outfit. But also funny that this is shown as this reconciliation between the two that ends up not lasting a single sequence following this. Anyway, we get to sequence 10, another shorter sequence here that actually starts with the assassination mission of us instantly going into the La Peltier, finding him at a party where he's celebrating the king's upcoming execution, and he ends up being in the center of a room on the second floor. That ends up actually being relatively easy to just go up to him and assassinate him, especially with the disguise skill. But there also is a unique kill opportunity allowing you to poison him, though again, that always just felt harder than just running in there and killing him in a more simple manner. But through this, we do learn that Germain will be at the execution. I can't believe it. And what do you know, the next mission's literally called the execution, which I do find funny that the mission gets set up as if you're actually going to be killing Germain here, when very clearly that was not happening, where we have 2 full sequences left in the game. But the section ends up being really massive in scale here, probably having the largest crowd in the entire game. though it is a crowd that you don't do much interacting with, as really all you have to do is just rush towards Germain's location, and even if you are detected, once you get there, the story progresses anyway, with Germain really making a show of this, talking about how Arno is witnessing the rebirth of the Templar Order, and that he murdered Delasare to get rid of corruption, very much feeling reminiscent to Bellic's speech from the assassin perspective, to where obviously it becomes very clear that, again, Germain's essentially mirroring off of Bellic's beliefs, again playing into that element of fanaticism. But also here, after the king's execution, we do him saying that he's avenged Jacques de Merlet, because what a great payoff to that this was. But again, Germain here ends up making his leave, giving Arno this dilemma of chasing after him or fighting alongside Elise, who does want Arno to go after Germain, though obviously he ends up siding with sticking with Elise, to Elise's frustration, to where we later have to chase her down once again, which can be an annoying section, as you have to follow her while also defending her, aka fighting off other guards, to where if she gets too far away from you, the mission fails. Which, again, what happened to those adaptive missions, and again, that happens pretty often in this mission, to where, again, I always found this kind of annoying to play, but the mission does culminate with this argument between Arno and Elise, with Elise being frustrated at how he can let Germain go, with Arno saying he did it to save her life, while Elise says that it wasn't his to save, and that she doesn't need his help if he doesn't have the stomach for revenge. Which again shows how far gone Elise is at this point. Obviously her being literally willing to sacrifice her own life to get this so-called revenge. Also kind of blatantly not caring about Arno. But again, thinking that Arno is in the same space, that he only cared about revenge, when in reality Arno only cares about her. But again, it's ironic that Arno in this spot is doing anything he can do to save Elise, which ironically ends up pushing her away. Which in essence puts Arno back in the same spot he was back in sequence 2, where now he has been pushed away by Elise once again, leaving him with no one to support him other than the assassins. Which, about that, end up finishing the sequence with Arno returning to the Assassin Council for the first time in a few sequences, where what do you know, they don't approve of him going off and killing targets without their permission, and acting on his own agenda, and called out for not caring about the assassin ideals and joining them for revenge. Which I love how Arno replies to this with saying, "for redemption," which is funny that even he's not denying that he doesn't give a shit about the assassins. But again, at least him being exiled from the Brotherhood, obviously being this down point for Arno, with him having lost all his support once again, taking us to sequence 11, where months later we catch up with Arno having returned to drinking and lives in the abandoned Delasare estate, with us seeing him wake up from a hangover, struggling to remember what had previously happened, but him realizing that his pocket watch is gone, which is funny that we're meant to care about this when this hadn't been focused on since sequence 2. But again, this leads to this weird flashback sequence where the play is him the previous night as he gets into a drunk bar fight and ends up having to sneak his way to stealing booze, which is just bizarre. Again, very surreal for an AC game. But obviously, again, this ends up leading to him needing to get his watch back from a gang leader that happens to have taken over the entire Palace of Versailles somehow, leading to a tedious section of you having to stealth your way through it in a spot where they actually don't even give you the opportunity to buy more supplies in between missions here. Feeling like the game kind of screwing you over if you're not well stocked coming into this. Though beyond that, obviously, we end up getting a lot of visions from previous events that happened at Versailles, which, again, there's a lot of, which is kind of ridiculous. And it all culminates in a final encounter with the gang leader who has some soldiers around him, which can be really difficult here, especially if low on supplies. But again, Arno ends up killing all of them, only for none of them to actually have the watch, with Elise showing up afterwards to reveal that she already had it, which means that we killed all of them for nothing. But it leads to Arno reigniting the argument between the two, with Arno thinking that she wants something from him, and says, "sorry that I care more about you than killing Germain." And Arno admitting that he wanted her, wants to prevent what happened to her father from happening again. Which, while decent content from Arno here, and now him making his intentions clear to Elise, they're clearly still on very opposite wavelengths, where all this was clearly being set up for disaster. But again, he ends up agreeing to return to Paris and helping her out after she says that the Arno she loves wouldn't question it, which again felt like very clear manipulation tactics from Elise, where again at this point it becomes very clear that she looks at Arno very much as an ally to help her achieve her goals over someone that she has genuine romantic feelings for, as she doesn't seem to have any genuine care for him or herself in this spot, where she is so preoccupied with her revenge that leads to her treating Arno as, again, this tool to utilize, which again does make you feel for Arno in that she's just leading him down a path that is just gonna lead to him having even more heartbreak. But I do think this also makes this being what gets Arno out of this rut to be a bit ridiculous, regardless, where again, typically in this spot where we have this major down point for the protagonist, that main character ends up growing through this experience. Though straight up, I don't feel like Arno learns anything at all through this sequence. Again, he just ends up being the same person that he was in the previous sequence, which again, I think plays a major issue into Arno as a character. The fact that his development isn't something that is really achieved until the end of the game, which really makes his return from the abyss following this to feel very unearned. But before we return to Paris, Arno says that there's one thing that he needs to do, which I guess is assassinate Latouche, which again is funny considering the big moment of Arno's return as an assassin is to kill Latouche, the most pathetic character in this game. But it ends up being actually a solid assassination mission here, taking place at an execution with a massive crowd that you can social stealth through. There's also a lot of buildings surrounding the area that allow you to parkour through them, to where, well, this is again another assassination that's pretty easy just to run up to Latouche and kill him that way. There's also a unique kill opportunity here that's actually pretty cool, and you being able to find Victor and Hugo, who are meant to be executed here, and swap places with them, and proceed to assassinate Latouche as you're taken up to the guillotine, which again, I think as a whole, this is a pretty solid assassination here. But through this, we do learn that Germain's main conspirator is Robespierre, because we need to add in a last-second historical figure to the game. Before hunting him down, we obviously get our final server bridge mission, which has us going to medieval Paris, where we do get a parkour section through the catacombs that culminates in us reaching a battlefield that has us having to cross through it while cans are being shot at us, which again, really cool mission from a pure set piece perspective, though also not the most fun gameplay experience, where it very much feels like a mission coming out of AC3, to where, again, as a whole, a largely passable mission here, where again, I very much enjoy the initial parkour segment, though again, the final portions of this mission can just be a pain, where it just feels kind of random where the cannons land, where there's just sometimes where you'll die out of the blue, which can be kind of dumb. But either way, this takes us to sequence 12, the final sequence of the game, which obviously has Arno Elise trying to find Germain, which their plan in doing so is by going through Robespierre, by attending the Festival of the Supreme Being, which ends up being probably my least favorite mission in the entire game, with this mission just being a massive pain to get through, where again, you kind of have to do it undetected, where if you do get detected, you're pretty screwed with how many enemies there are, where while by this point in the game, you should have the disguise skill, which can be very helpful throughout many of these portions, it does feel like just a massive pain to get through, where it feels like you're always under detection at any point. Again, here you have to do tasks that end up discrediting Robespierre, probably being the one point in the game where we're following in line with AC3 of making Arno integral to real life historical events. In essence, having Arno and Elise responsible for the fall of Robespierre, which is really stupid, though really the most difficult portion of this mission has you having to defend Elise as guards approach you, which again end up being pretty difficult enemy encounters. If you get detected, where just a swarm of enemies, they'll follow you following that. And along with that, you also have to plant letters undetected after that, which is also kind of tedious. But it's funny that the following mission has it turned out that your strategy from the following one worked out too well, and that Robespierre has been arrested, making it hard for them to now get to him, only for him to escape anyway, leading to us hunting him down to a hotel that ends up being another massive restricted area. But once finding Robespierre, Elise ends up shooting him in the jaw, get him to speak, showing Elise becoming, again, increasingly brutal as we near Germain. Also, I mean, Robespierre's injured jaw actually does correlate to real life history, but either way, he ends up revealing Germain's location, in that being the temple, which I guess there's only one temple in Paris where they just instantly know what he's talking about. But it takes us to the final mission in the game, the Germain assassination mission, taking place at the temple, aka the fortress that we saw back in the initial mission in the prologue, making everything come full circle here. Obviously, as they stand in front of the temple, we do see Elise acting really cold here, telling Arno that they should go separately, as less chance they both get caught, and if he has the shot at Germain, he takes it. Again, seeming to be really gung-ho and increasing their odds at one of them killing Germain no matter the cost, though Arno really ends up hyping up this mission, saying that he can't detect any weak points, despite it actually being a relatively easy assassination, where if you know where you're going, which obviously in an initial playthrough you wouldn't necessarily know that, but if you do, it's a very simple path where you just climb to the rooftop of the nearby building and jump onto the nearby tower and climb up to the top of the castle, where obviously Germain is going to be on the roof, which again just kind of makes sense that's the case. Before Arno is able to assassinate him, Germain uses the Sword of Eden, which is back in the story, where again it makes you question where was the sword before this, as again he had access to this tomb before this, so it's like, why didn't he ever use the sword? But following this, Germain disappears Though this time, the game actually does tell you where he went, which is to the tomb, obviously, where the sword and codex were originally hidden, leading up to the final boss battle in the game, where Elise acts as a distraction while Arno essentially assassinates Germain 3 times, all while if you're detected, he ends up using the sword against you, which can kill you rather quickly. But really, if you come into this with potions, this ends up being a pretty simple encounter where you can just outright run towards him, as long as he's not looking at you, and you'll have enough health to survive. To where, again, using your potion to reset your health after every attempt allows this to be a pretty easy boss, and again, a kind of underwhelming final boss by the end of it. But anyway, after the final strike, Arno gets struck down under some rubble, conveniently to stop him from being able to stop what is about to happen, and that Elise comes to his aid. But as expected, in her seeing Germain attempt to escape, we see Elise make the decision that Arno didn't make, and her deciding to go for Germain, leaving him behind, to where we get this melodramatic moment here of Elise being overpowered by the Sword of Eden and it becoming unstable as Arno dashes towards them after breaking free, obviously killing Elise instantly, to where we do see Arno rushing to her side. Obviously this tragic moment to where, while again, for Elise, I do think this is clearly the path that she was always heading for and seemingly was actively striving for. Again, I do feel like for Arno in this spot, who did so much to protect Elise throughout this narrative, and how he previously mentioned that all he wanted to do was not fail again like he did with Delasair, and for him to end this game failing once again. And it does feel like a tragic ending for Arno and Elise's relationship, though, again, when it does feel necessary, as I don't feel like the story would have made much sense if Elise did survive all this, to where, while I do think it can lead to the frustrations with Elise's character for her being so tunnel vision and for Arno to be so love struck, I always felt like this ending worked for me. Again, playing into the themes of fanaticism, or at least in this case, obsession, with Elise's obsession over revenge leading to her death, while also Arno's obsession with Elise leads to him losing everything here. Again, all feeling like a massive tragedy. To where beyond that, just sad to see Elise dead in Arno's arms, to where while the writing of their relationship can be very mixed, to where, again, I would get it if people didn't fully buy into their relationship to begin with. Again, I personally did find this to be a pretty gut-wrenching scene, though one that I do find a bit strange as the way that they end Arno's story in the main game, to where, again, this feels like the moment where he finally does develop, where he does actually come to terms with the central themes of the game, which we don't get much resolution to where we do get more resolution in Dead Kings, but even then, that doesn't feel satisfactory enough to me, where we don't get to see what Arno learned through this experience, but more so just hear about his reflections of it later on, to where I'm surprised they never did much with Arno's character beyond that, to where, while obviously Unity's failures definitely played a factor into that and the lack of interest in Arno as a character, I again do feel like there is a lot of intrigue that could be made of showing Arno's development beyond the death of Elise, but sadly it never really gets touched up on. But again, after checking on Elise's dead body, Arno then proceeds to see Germain barely alive, leading to our final bit of gameplay and us walking over to him and assassinating him, which Arno does as slowly as possible, giving us a final vision that ends up being a strange one, as we do end up actually talking to Germain, and in essence, again, kind of ends up being more of a typical memory corridor, which, again, not really explain how this is happening, but again, through this, he ends up talking about his struggles as a sage, though really not much really new comes from this. Well, also this all being a bit of a strange farewell to Germain, who, again, is a character that could have been interesting, where I do wish they did more with him outside of just making him generically evil, where, again, he really has no development outside of him being a sage, especially considering, again, he is so resolute in the Templar ideals, which is not very sage-like either. So again, he ends up being a pretty boring final antagonist here, despite the fact that, again, he has an interesting premise as a character. But again, through this, Arno ends up taking up the Sword of Eden for himself, which ends up being the best sword in the game, though, again, it would have been cool if they allowed you to use that before the main game was done. But also weird in multiple aspects. I mean, one, wouldn't you think that he wouldn't want to use the sword, considering this is literally what killed Elise, where wouldn't that be traumatizing to him? But even beyond that, isn't it really dumb that Arno is literally walking through the streets of Paris with the Sword of Eden on his side? But either way, the game does end up concluding here with a final monologue from Arno, in which he reflects on the Creed and what he learned through this game, which, again, just comes off as dumb, both in the fact that it's dumb to end the game with the scene of the characters giving a massive monologue of what they learned throughout their experience instead of just showing us what they learned, but again, also, none of this actually even makes sense with Arno's character up to this point, where, again, up to this point, Arno had not thought a single second about the Creed, yet here he has these wise words about the Creed being a warning and that everyone is responsible for their own actions, and only themselves can guard against obsessions, with him saying that ideals give way to dogma, and dogma becomes fanaticism. Again, just saying the basic theme of the game. So again, I do think this could have been an interesting theme to tackle over the course of an AC game, of showing the impact of blindly following the ideals of either faction and showing the harm that can cause, where, again, that could have been cool, but instead we had to more so just focus it on the Arno and Elise relationship, along with getting a very prolonged Templar hunt and a narrative that, as a whole, just felt very rushed and underdeveloped for almost every character and every plot point involved, to where that ends up making the story not fully come together here. And I think there is potential with this story. It simply is executed in a way that makes the story come off as very underwhelming to me. But again, that's not the end just yet, as we get one final scene taking place years later as Arno returns to the temple alongside Napoleon for some reason, where they end up finding Germain's corpse, now being decayed, and end up placing him in the catacombs, with the final moments of the game having Bishop say that Arno won this fight 2 centuries ago, before it started, and that the Templars won't bother searching for Germain's remains, as he'll be too decayed, aka this game doesn't matter. Again, this is essentially just them openly telling you, hey, this entire modern day story, yeah, it doesn't lead to anything, because again, the entire point of the modern day story was, oh, we're looking for a sage to stop Abstergo from finding them, only for us to not find the sage, and even be told that Abstergo's not even going to bother searching for this sage. So again, the assassins gain nothing from this, the initiate gains nothing from this, and I gain nothing from this, to where, again, this just ends up being an entirely pointless entry from a modern day perspective, to where, again, I remember I was so pissed at the time when this came out. During retrospect, again, it ends up just being kind of funny that they literally didn't even pretend to have any sort of progression in the modern day. But again, I remember at the time, this was so frustrating to be so hyped coming into Unity and Rogue, where, as much as I do think AC4's modern day is bad in retrospect, I enjoyed it at the time, and I did think there were interesting things set up there, only for, again, none of that to be followed up on here. Well, again, we got a little bit more of that by the time we get to Syndicate. Even that comes off as underwhelming, to where, again, as someone that is a massive fan of the modern day and is part of what made me fall in love with Assassin's Creed, it is so funny how much of a downfall the modern day takes in this specific entry, with just no progression in the slightest. But with that, that is the entirety of Assassin's Creed Unity, a game that still and always will be a game that had potential, but simply just never lived up to it. To where, while it came out to terrible reception due to its technical issues, those have never been my fundamental issues with the game, where my problems with the game lie in almost every other facet of the game. So again, you can very much tell the high ambition they had for this game, and see what they were trying to do to create this ultimate assassin fantasy by largely attempting to upgrade systems from the OG formula. The problem is, again, those systems for the most part are not as good as even in the previous entries, to where, while this is a game that adds a lot of flashiness, it does very much lack in having substance that the older games had, to where mixing that in with a largely shallow narrative with a lot of missed potential there, it really leaves Unity as a lackluster Assassin's Creed game, to where, while I will credit it for what it at least attempts to do, it trying to do something good is not enough to actually make it a good game. So again, it's not as bad as it was initially received, obviously, though again, I still very much struggle with assessing it as one of the better games in the series. I think it's a game that had the potential to be one of the best in the series, but simply never end up actually living up to that. But again, with that, those are my thoughts on Assassin's Creed Unity. Now, straight up, I did very much consider talking about Dead Kings when making this video, as Dead Kings, in essence, is an epilogue to Unity, and I do think there is development for Arno in that would have been worth talking about, though straight up with the length of this video already, I decided to forgo that for this video, though I would not be opposed to making that sort of video at some point down the road, alongside all the other AC DLCs. Again, obviously I'll be back next year for Syndicate. You can stay tuned for that. Though again, there's still other AC videos I would like to do down the road, even though again, I'm in a spot where I don't really care about Assassin's Creed as much as I used to. I still feel like there are other basic rankings I always intended on doing that I never really got the time to do so, to where, again, things like protagonist rankings, modern day rankings, even like narrative rankings. Again, I think there are interesting ideas that I would like to do down the road, but again, don't know when exactly I'll do them. But anyway, those are my pretty extensive thoughts on Assassin's Creed Unity. Thank you for watching.